Tell your story.
Change the conversation.
Organized by students. TEDx Youth at SHC.
Over the past few years, I've been increasingly obsessed about the future. Now, as a history teacher, this is a little surprising and somewhat unfamiliar ground. This obsession, like so many things, began with the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic. If you recall, the pandemic began to take over our lives at the end of March and into April of 2020. By the summer, we were being fed a steady diet of data, usually in the form of charts. And then the terms flatten the curve and bend the curve became well understood references to the collective task in front of us. Our relationship with the future briefly changed. We realized that our actions today had a clear impact on our lives in the future. Newspaper articles taught us that our actions today had exponential consequences in the future. For most of us, that was a short-term experience. As vaccines were developed and administered and the virus's lethality diminished, our focus shifted back from the future to the present. Yet the experience got me thinking about my relationship with the future and my role as a history teacher. I realized that I have to teach my students about the future. Yogi Berra said that the future ain't what it used to be. And today he is more right than ever. For most of recorded history, people saw the future as full of threats and uncertainty. Stability was prized. Change was usually bad and viewed with suspicion and fear. That's changed in the past few centuries. For most of the history of the United States, particularly in the 20th century, optimism about the future has been an important part of our culture. However, today, in the middle of the third decade of the 21st century, this faith, this positive view of the future, has begun to fray. According to the Pew Research study done last year, Americans are so more pessimistic about several aspects of the future of the United States than ever. And a similar study about 10 years ago, prior to the pandemic, found that when asked about the country in 30 years, significant majorities said they saw a country in decline. I've polled the students that I teach. Most of them are 15, 16, and 17-year-olds, twice, first in 2021 and then just this year. And a majority of my students often think about their lives in the future in 5 or 10 years. And the majority of them are optimistic. They're looking forward to college and the years that follow. However, like the Pew study, when asked about the future of the United States and the world at large, a different picture emerges. Pessimism about the future increases from 10% to maybe 60%. And interestingly, the students and probably most people don't connect their personal future to the future in a broader context. They put their personal lives in the future in the context of their present lives, not in a future that reflects a broader context. In the commentary students wrote about as part of that questionnaire, some interesting nuances emerged. Compared to 2021, pessimism has deepened, with specific anxieties around the future of democracy, climate change, the direction of our society. Earlier sources of optimism, such as technological advances, are now more nuanced. They're balanced with concerns about potential threats those advances pose. As a teacher, I was particularly interested in the question, how much do you think you can help shape the future? Not surprisingly, the results were mixed. On the edges, there were those who think, yeah, I definitely can have an impact in the future, and they were balanced by those who were like, yeah, I definitely cannot. But two quotes reflect the majority of the views. The first one, individuals can do next to nothing alone. Only with the help of many will meaningful change occur. With the help of others, I hope to accomplish a lot. And the second, I think that the impact of one individual, it's hard to make a difference. I think the future needs to be improved by all of us. If the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us anything, it's that large problems are not going to be solved by someone else. The challenges we face in the future require us that we act together as a community. But in the 21st century, there are more changes happening, and they're happening at a faster rate than ever before. By many accounts, we've passed this inflection point where the rate of change is now higher than our ability to adapt to it. Most of our public institutions were simply not designed for this pace of change. Our students, our children, know about the immense challenges they face, but they don't know how to connect their present lives to their lives in the future, where they're living with those challenges. This isn't something I'm imposing on our kids. We adults, we're modeling this behavior, these choices, and that inaction for them. They look to us. We can do better. We have to do better. We have to find new, explicit ways to connect the present to the future. And in many ways, the pandemic provides a model. We saw then how our actions in the present would bend the curve in the future. We all took action, often different ones in different places, and the effects of our actions, like mask wearing and social distancing here in San Francisco, to name a couple, were relayed to us in the weeks and months that followed in the form of charts and graphs of infection rates across the media. But more than just feedback was that the future we were working for, that return to normalcy, was one that we could practically see and feel. We had a relationship with it. It was this relationship, the familiarity, the emotional attachment that enabled us to work towards it, to take action. But when we don't think that much about the future, when we don't empathize with our future selves, when we don't imagine what it feels like to live in a possible future, we forego the opportunity to bend the arc of the future in a direction that we want. As Jane McGonigal, an author and researcher at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, California, has observed, our future selves are strangers to us, literally. fMRI studies show that our brain, when we imagine ourselves in the future, our brains behave as if we're thinking about a stranger, a completely different person. And the farther out you go, the more stranger we are to ourselves. This makes it far more difficult to empathize with our future selves. And contrast that to our relationship with our past selves. We can look back and remember not only what we were doing in the past, but often how we felt. And the emotions we feel today are sometimes nearly as raw as they were at the time. But if we treat our future selves like strangers, it's so much harder to develop that empathy. So empathy is based on your ability to push past your own perspective so that you can appreciate someone else's, a friend or a stranger's, and understand how they're seeing things and how they're feeling. Self-control, our ability not to make impulsive decisions in the present, is based on empathy as well. Except that the stranger with whom you're empathizing is your future self. When we exert self-control, say, not to buy that thing or to order that rich dessert, we're doing it based on our relationship with our future selves because we're empathizing with them. Ed Young noted this in his article in The Atlantic. He said, it's your present you taking a hit to help out future you. Our empathy for our future selves is needed to drive our choices in the present. Looking at my students, most of them do imagine themselves in the future. There is a connection. The problem is that they can imagine themselves in the future, and when they do, it's a future that looks like today. We need to start thinking about a future that doesn't look like today, any more than today looks like it did 20 years ago, when Apple didn't make phones. A Swedish company named Nokia made the best smartphones, and there was no Instagram, no Apple Pay, no Ubers, no Teslas on the road, no Spotify. In so many ways, it was a different world. And we need to imagine ourselves in a world that is that different. Some of you may be thinking, look, how can you possibly do that? How can you create a future context when it hasn't even happened yet? And it turns out, with the advent of the atomic age in the late 1940s, when we developed the ability to wipe out life as we know it on the planet, we also started to develop methods to forecast the future, to help manage that risk. Not to predict it, but just to take a few threads from the present and follow them out into the future and ask, what if? This is a skill that can be learned. There are defined approaches and methodologies that have been successfully used to prepare future scenarios. Many of the same skills we use to study history, exploring what's changed over time and why it did, to seek to understand what it was like to live in the past, we can use those to create an understanding of what it will feel like to live in the future. To develop possible futures, stories of what might happen in the future, we draw on both historical drivers of change and sources of change and stability in the present. We can teach students how to create rich future scenarios based on equally rigorous thinking skills so that they can see possible futures and empathize with their future selves living in those scenarios. Some of those scenarios may not be pretty. What does it feel like to live in a place where the temperatures are above 115 degrees for weeks or months instead of a few days each year? Or when there's no more snow on the mountains of Colorado or California, and how that changes how much water you have for the rest of the year. But it's not just doom and gloom, it's also future scenarios based on hope, based on actions we can take today. We can help our children and ourselves think more deeply, more clearly about what it might be like to live in the future by connecting our future selves with thoughtful, positive future narratives. We're better equipped to make the necessary choices and take the needed action now to bend the curve of the future into one which we want to live. And now more than ever, we face challenges at a scale that require us to act now. As Robert Kennedy said, our future may lie beyond our vision, but it is not completely beyond our control. Our future is literally calling out to us, begging us not to be ready to adapt to it, but to shape it. It demands our attention. We must act now to show our future selves, our children, and the generations to come the care they deserve. Thank you.